Most people think a higher household income should solve the problem. 2 salaries instead of 1, 2 careers instead of 1. 2 checks coming into the same account every month. On paper, it sounds like security, it sounds like margin, it sounds like what every sensible middle-class family should want. I understand why people believe it. If 1 income can support a household, then surely 2 incomes should do more than support it. Surely 2 incomes should create room for savings, room for investing, room for vacations, room for breathing, room for a little dignity after the bills are paid. And yet, I have watched a great many households earn what should have been enough money only to find themselves more fragile than their parents were on 1 income. That is one of the most important financial lies in modern life. The second income was sold as liberation. Very often it became obligation. That is the real subject here, not whether 2 incomes are morally good or bad, not whether both partners should work, not whether ambition is admirable. All of that is secondary. The primary question is much colder. What did the second income actually do to the structure of the family balance sheet? That is the question most people never ask. They look at the gross number and feel reassurance. They see the combined household income and think, we should be fine. Then they wake up and discover that if the car breaks, the whole month shivers. If one person gets sick, the budget starts bleeding. If a child needs more attention, the entire system feels like it is being held together with wire. This is the quiet horror of the modern middle class. People making what once would have looked like good money feel permanently 1 bad week away from financial embarrassment. And the worst part is that they often blame themselves. They think they failed at personal finance. Very often they are standing inside a structural trap. The source document you gave me makes exactly that case. It describes a 2-income household earning $133,000 a year, comfortably inside the top quarter of American households, and yet still feeling paycheck to paycheck, thinly saved, overworked, and fragile. It then connects that feeling to what Elizabeth Warren called the 2-income trap, where the second income does not create safety so much as become absorbed into a more expensive baseline life. Fay file site Fayturn 98 file 0 Fay, that is the right frame. The public keeps talking about spending as though it were mostly a matter of discipline and character. Character matters, discipline matters, but structure matters too. If the structure changes around you, then the meaning of the same salary changes with it. A man earning $100,000 in one environment is not living the same economic life as a man earning $100,000 in another. That should be obvious. Yet people keep pretending salary is a complete statement. It is not. Salary is only one side of the ledger. Cost structures decide the rest. And the cost structure of the modern family changed in ways most people still do not fully understand. Let me say it plainly. The trap is not that both spouses work. The trap is that once both spouses work, the fixed costs of the household often rise until both incomes are no longer a source of strength. They become the minimum required to hold a life together. That is the difference between flexibility and fragility. A flexible household can lose one stream and still remain standing. A fragile household cannot. The modern 2-income household often looks stronger from the outside and is weaker underneath. That is what people need to understand. And if they understand it, a great deal of confusion suddenly stops being mysterious. They stop asking, why do we make this much and still feel broke? They begin asking the better question, what did we build around the second income? Now, to understand this properly, you have to go backward before you can go forward. You have to understand what the second income originally represented, because at first, the second income was not the engine, it was the reserve. That is the important distinction. The source text goes back to 1970 and makes this contrast very clearly. In that period, a typical middle-class family often had one primary breadwinner and one parent at home, and the source argues that a median single income could still support a median-priced home, basic needs, savings, and some breathing room. More importantly, the ATT home spouse represented latent earning power that could be activated in an emergency. Fay file site Fayturn 98 file 0 Fay, that hidden reserve matters more than most people realize. A backup plan is one of the most valuable assets a family can possess, not because it gets used every day, because it changes what happens when life stops cooperating. If the breadwinner lost work, the family did not instantly fall off a cliff. The reserve could be activated. It was not elegant, it was not painless, but it existed. That is what margin looks like in real life. Margin is not just money in an account. Margin is the number of ways a system can absorb shock without collapsing. That one-income household had margin in more than one form. Its housing burden was often lower relative to income. Its childcare burden was lower because one parent was home. Its household labor costs were lower because more of that labor happened inside the family rather than being purchased outside. And the second adult in the house remained, economically speaking, an undeployed resource that matters enormously. The modern family, by contrast, often starts the game with its reserves already committed. That is the whole trap in one sentence. The emergency plan became the operating plan, and the moment you do that, one of the most valuable protections a household can have disappears. The source text makes this point directly too. It says that today, in a world where two-income households are common, both incomes are often already fully committed to the monthly cost structure. That means the old backup plan has already been spent just to keep baseline expenses going. Fe Philosite Fe Turn 98 File 0 Fe. This is one of the reasons why modern families can feel richer and less secure at the same time. That sounds like a contradiction only until you see the structure. Two incomes increase purchasing power. Then the system bid against that purchasing power until it became the new baseline. That is what happened. The second income did not sit there politely waiting to become wealth. It got competed away, first in housing, then in schools, then in childcare, then in commuting, then in convenience spending created by two exhausted adults trying to keep the machine running. The public likes to pretend this is mostly about bad choices. Some of it is, a lot of it is an arms race. And in an arms race, even the winners often end up more vulnerable than before. Housing is where this becomes easiest to understand. When two-income households became common, the amount families could bid for the same house naturally rose. That was inevitable. A house that once had to be financed from one income could now be financed from two. What happens when more money chases the same desirable neighborhoods? Prices rise, of course they do. No lectures required. This is arithmetic behaving normally. The source document makes that point with force. It says that when two incomes became the new norm, the price of desirable housing in good school districts was bid up accordingly, turning educational opportunity into a housing cost arms race. Families used two incomes to chase the same fixed stock of good neighborhoods, and the result was higher fixed housing costs, not broad new security. Fe Philosite Fe Turn 98 File 0 Fe, that is exactly the kind of systemic problem most people experience without naming. They think they chose the expensive house in some sense. Yes. In another sense, the market structure forced the choice set upward. If the school district matters, and if the school district is embedded in the housing market, then the family is not really buying a house only. It is buying admission. Admission to safety, admission to social stability, admission to a different peer group, admission to educational possibility. That is a very powerful thing to bid on. And when millions of households bid using two incomes, prices absorb the second income quickly. This is why a family can double its earning power and still feel like it got nowhere, because the benchmark moved, not just the salary. That is a brutal feature of middle-class life. The world keeps moving the benchmark at the same time you are trying to climb. Now, let us get more concrete, because one of the strongest sections of the source is where it follows the second income dollar by dollar and shows how little of it may truly remain once the whole system is honestly counted. The source imagines a household where one partner earns $70,000 and the other earns $50,000. It then walks through what happens to that second income because of progressive tax brackets and payroll taxes. A large share of that $50,000 is taxed at the margin. Then childcare takes a huge bite. Commuting and transportation take another bite. Then convenience and exhaustion spending appear because two full-time working adults have less time for cooking, cleaning, home maintenance, and family management. By the time the source adds those together, The net effect of the second income can shrink toward almost nothing or even negative in some cases. Fay-Falicite Fay-Turn 98 File 0 Fay. That is the kind of arithmetic people hate because it feels like an insult. They hear it and think, that cannot be right. We are working all year and you are telling me the second income barely moved us forward. Yes, that is exactly what I am telling you. Not in every case. In enough cases to matter, and it matters because people make commitments based on the gross number, not the net structural value. That is the hidden poison. The house is bought based on the combined income. The cars are leased based on the combined income. The school district is selected based on the combined income. The child care is accepted because both incomes need to continue. The whole life gets sized to the gross number. Then the household discovers that the second income is doing much less than they emotionally assumed it was doing. Now the trap closes, because even if the net contribution is small after the whole system is counted, honestly, the lifestyle cannot easily step back down. You cannot casually unwind the mortgage. You cannot effortlessly erase the commute. You cannot instantly recreate one-parent domestic labor. Once both adult schedules are already full. This is how fragility is created, not in one dramatic bad decision, in a whole structure built gradually around assumptions that sounded reasonable at the time. I have always believed that the most dangerous financial commitments are the ones that feel mathematically defensible under perfect continuity. As long as both incomes continue is one of the most dangerous phrases in modern household finance, because life does not respect that phrase. People get sick, people burn out, parents age. Children need different things at different times. Jobs disappear, careers stall, a marriage hits strain, a pregnancy changes the math, a special needs diagnosis changes the math, a layoff changes the math, a mental health collapse changes the math. A body that used to absorb the grind stops absorbing it. That is the real problem. The structure built around two incomes often has no respect for human variability. It requires both engines to run at all times simply to keep the machine from stalling. That is not prosperity, that is high output vulnerability. The source text says this very clearly too. It argues that the single income family from earlier decades had margin because one adult was still available as reserve labor, while the modern two-income family has already played that card and therefore has less resilience when something goes wrong. Fay-Falicite Fay-Turn 98 File 0 Fay. This is why bankruptcy risk can rise even when income rises. People think more income automatically means more safety. Not if fixed costs expand faster than flexibility. Not if the system burns the backup plan for normal operations. Not if every month requires full power from both adults just to maintain the baseline. That is what the source is really saying when it points to Elizabeth Warren S2. Income trap. The trap is not that people worked. The trap is that the household became less shock resistant while appearing more affluent. That distinction matters because appearances fool people into delaying corrective action. They think we make too much to feel this broke. They tell themselves the next raise will solve it. The next bonus, the next job move, the next refinance, the next tax refund, the next round of discipline. And sometimes the problem is not the next dollar. It is that the whole structure has been built around the wrong definition of enough. That is the sentence a lot of people need to hear. Enough is not what the bank approves. Enough is what the household can carry if life stops behaving. Normally for a while, that is a much more intelligent definition. Banks do not underwrite your marriage. Banks do not underwrite your energy level. Banks do not underwrite a parent's illness or a child's crisis, or your ability to keep tolerating a 60-minute commute and 2 exhausted evenings every weeknight forever. Banks underwrite numbers. Families live inside reality. Those are not the same terrain. Now, if all this is true, what should a family do? This is where people usually make the second mistake. They hear the diagnosis and imagine the only solution is some dramatic ideological reversal. One partner quits immediately. The family flees to a rural town. Children vanish from the cost structure by magic. Everything gets simplified in one brave month. Life does not usually work like that. The source text does not argue for reckless simplification. It argues for a mindset shift. Specifically, it says households should start treating the second income as temporary, even if it is not, and should build a one-income foundation where fixed costs are sized so that one income can carry them if necessary. Then the second income becomes savings, investing, debt payoff, margin, and choice, rather than oxygen faith-philosophy. Fay turn 98 file 0 Fay. That is exactly the right move. Not panic redesign. A1. Income foundation is one of the most powerful concepts in the entire piece. Not because every family can achieve it immediately in pure form, because it gives the right target. It asks the household to rebuild fixed costs around survivability, not around maximum approved consumption. That means the mortgage is no longer sized to the outer edge of what two salaries can technically service. It means the cars are no longer chosen as if nothing will ever interrupt the flow. It means the family begins asking a different question about every recurring obligation. Can one income carry this? That question alone will improve a lot of lives, because it forces people to confront the hidden cost of their lifestyle in terms of fragility, not just in terms of dollars. Let's turn spending decisions into resilience decisions. That is the adult way to do finance. Not can we afford it this month? Can our structure survive it next year if one engine goes quiet? I have always thought that households underestimate the emotional value of margin because margin is invisible until the day it becomes everything. A family with a one-income foundation may not look as rich. Their neighbors may drive newer cars. Their house may be smaller. Their vacations may be less photogenic. But when someone gets sick or laid off or burned out or simply wants to stop sacrificing every weekday to the machine, that family suddenly looks rich in the only way that matters. They have room to think, room to wait, room to reconfigure, room to protect their children from adult panic, room to let one partner step back, room to make a better decision instead of the nearest one. That is wealth. Not the size of the granite kitchen, not the prestige of the zip code room. The source text also makes an important point about what the second income should actually become if it is not swallowed by baseline expenses. It says that second income should be converted into emergency funds, retirement savings, taxable investments, and eventually optionality. In other words, the second income should buy back choice rather than just fund a bigger lifestyle. Faithfully cite Fay turn 98 file 0 Fay. That is an excellent way to think. Every dollar of the second income used to lower fragility is buying future freedom. Every dollar used only to inflate the baseline is buying future dependence. That is the hidden trade. People think the second income is simply extra money number. It is either margin or trap. It becomes one or the other depending on what you build around it. And because most people never define its role consciously, the surrounding system claims it by default. That is why the trap is so powerful. It does not feel like a trap while it is being built. It feels like normal life. 2 good jobs. A decent school district, a safe neighborhood, reliable cars, childcare that keeps the machine moving, prepared meals because both adults are tired, a little convenience to compensate for exhaustion. Everything feels individually reasonable. And then one day the household looks up and realizes it has built a life that requires near perfect continuity from 2 full-time adults for perhaps 20 straight years. That is when the fear begins. Not because they are irresponsible, because they are overcommitted. Now, there is another part of the source that deserves more attention than people will probably give it. The psychological humiliation of high-income fragility. The source begins with this feeling. A household earning into the top quarter of Americans should, in theory, feel secure. Instead, they feel confused, ashamed, and financially weak. The source says many people look at their combined income and think, we make too much money to feel this broke. Fay cite Fay turn 98 file 0 Fay. That sentence is emotionally important because it explains why this trap persists. Shame is a poor teacher. A family that feels ashamed of its fragility often hides from the structural diagnosis. They keep telling themselves they simply need to tighten up a little more, work a little harder, push through a little longer. Get one more raise. They are reluctant to admit the architecture itself is wrong because that would require deeper change than skipping restaurant meals. But architecture is often the issue. I say that not to absolve foolishness. There is plenty of foolishness in the world. I say it because once people can see the structure clearly, they stop moralizing their situation so much and start redesigning it. That is a much more productive use of emotion, because emotion should serve action, not just produce guilt. Now, I want to be careful here. This is not an argument for some nostalgic fantasy that every family should return to the social arrangement of 1970. Life is more complicated than that. Women working is not the problem. Ambition is not the problem. Education is not the problem. Dual careers are not the problem in themselves. The problem is that the economy adjusted to the new purchasing power by absorbing it into fixed costs, and then families were taught to interpret that absorption as success. That is the bait and switch. The source text actually says this directly. It calls the two-income story one of the biggest financial bait and switches in modern American history, because what looked like added security often became added vulnerability once costs rose to consume both incomes. Fay Felicite, Fay Turn 98, File 0 Fay, that is a harsh sentence. It is also an accurate one. When everybody escalates, nobody necessarily wins. The bidding war for housing, the hidden tuition of school districts, the rise of childcare as a central middle-class expense, healthcare costs, college anxiety, transportation costs, all of these swallow the second income and then politely ask for more. That is why the family making good money can still feel like it is drowning. Not because arithmetic stopped working, because the game board changed, and when the board changes, old assumptions become expensive. This is why I tell people not to think only in terms of income goals. Think in terms of fragility budgets. How much of your monthly life must be paid, no matter what? How many separate things must continue going right for your structure to remain comfortable? How much of your peace depends on both adults remaining fully deployed, fully healthy, fully employed, and permanently willing to keep the machine running at its current intensity? Those are much better questions than how high can we push our lifestyle. Because when people ask better questions, they buy different houses, they choose different neighborhoods, they keep the older car longer, they tolerate less prestige in exchange for more optionality, they stop assuming every raise deserves a corresponding rise in obligations, they preserve the second income as reserve, then as investment, then as freedom. That is how the trap is reversed. Now, this is where some people object and say that making these sacrifices means falling behind socially. Yes, very often it does. That is part of the price. A family building on a one-income foundation may look less impressive than a family that fully deploys both incomes into visible consumption. That is fine. I have never known social comparison to be a good allocator of capital. Social comparison is the enemy of durability. It tells people to buy evidence of success rather than build the substance of it. The public loves visible prosperity because visible prosperity is easy to compare. True financial resilience is much quieter. You cannot see a strong emergency fund from the sidewalk. You cannot see low household fragility at a stoplight. You cannot see margin in the school pickup line. But the family who has those things is living in a different universe from the family whose whole life depends on next month arriving exactly on schedule. That is the universe people should want, not because it is glamorous, because it is humane. The source text ends with this same kind of insight. It says the families who truly thrive are not necessarily the ones who earn the most, but the ones who preserve flexibility, refuse to let expenses consume everything, and keep the backup plan in reserve rather than spending it just to keep up. Fay Felicite, Fay Turn 98, File 0 Fay. That is the whole lesson. Not earn less, not dream smaller, not reject ambition, preserve flexibility. That is what modern household finance should revolve around, because once flexibility is gone, every problem gets more expensive. A car repair becomes a crisis. A job loss becomes a disaster. A health event becomes a financial wound. A parent's illness becomes impossible to respond to cleanly. A child's changing needs become a source of panic instead of adjustment. This is why I say the trap is not really about income. It is about the disappearance of options. And options, much more than salary, are what make a family feel secure. If I were speaking to a couple sitting across from me at a kitchen table, both tired, both earning, both confused about why the math never seems to turn into peace, I would not begin by shaming them. I would begin by asking 3 questions. First, what part of your fixed monthly life truly requires 2 incomes, and what part only requires the belief that 2 incomes will continue forever? Second, if one of you had to step back for a year, what would actually break? Third, if the second income were treated not as spending power but as reserve and investment, how different would your life feel 5 years from now? Those are the questions that start rebuilding a structure, and structure is what matters. Not because budgeting is unimportant, because budgeting alone cannot solve a machine that was built around the wrong assumptions. This is also why I say a family cannot simply earn its way out of a trap it has not yet recognized. That line from the source is exactly right. You can earn your way out of many problems, but not out of a trap you do not know you are in. Fay Falicite Fay turn 98 file 0 Fay recognition comes first, then redesign, then discipline. Then the second income finally becomes what people imagined it was supposed to be all along. Not the fuel keeping the house from rolling backward every month. The thing that buys back the family as freedom. That is what the second income should have been from the beginning: reserve margin, investment, optionality. Not permission to bid harder against every other stressed family for a more expensive version of the same fragile life. Once people see that clearly, a lot of the fog disappears. They stop asking, why do we make too much to feel this broke? They start asking the better question. How do we stop spending both engines just to stand still? That is a much harder question. It is also the only one worth asking if what you want is not the appearance of prosperity, but the substance of it. Because prosperity is not the house you can barely carry. Prosperity is the life that does not collapse the moment one paycheck goes quiet. That is the standard. And once you adopt that standard, a lot of the modern American dream begins to look less like a dream and more like an invoice at that point. You finally have a chance to choose differently, and choosing differently, quietly and consistently, is usually how real financial dignity begins.